There are media reports that the UN is pressing Canada to extend our year-long commitment of troops to the peacekeeping mission, and that Canada is saying no. The Trudeau government committed 8 helicopters and 250 Canadian Forces members to provide medical evacuations in what has proved to be one of the most dangerous peacekeeping missions in history. That mission is supposed to end this coming July. Joining me now to discuss the mission and the latest is Leuprecht. He's joining us from Kingston and the Royal Military College. Professor Leuprecht, thank you very much for taking the time.
My pleasure.
What do we know about what we're hearing, these reports that the UN is asking for an extension of our commitment? Why is the UN asking for us to stay longer?
Well, because the mission is overstretched in terms of the too many demands and too few resources, as many UN missions are. So this is sort of nothing new. And so you have to beg and plead and, in quotation marks, steal in order to try to get people to contribute the capacities that are required. And a lot of the heavy lifting done, for better or for worse, is done by European allies. Many of them have their own challenges with equipment. And so it's always easier to go around and ask other people to pitch in more than for some of our allies perhaps to think that, you know, maybe this is their backyard and maybe this is sort of where they need to pony up. Now, of course, we have an interest in sort of the stability of Mali, and we know what happens when you have serious instability in the region, migrant flows and whatnot that divide our European allies and then cause disunity among our second most strategic partnership, which is with Europe. But in practice, it still means that Canada is limited in what it can and what it probably should do. We have lots of obligations. If you think of the enhanced forward presence, where we have a deployment of 540 troops to Latvia as a framework nations, we've taken on the training mission in Iraq. These are our collective defense obligations. There are international security obligations. So the regional stability UN mission stuff is important, but it's sort of somewhat discretionary, I think, from a Canadian perspective. Mm-hmm. So Canada pitches in when it can, with what it can.
So far we are hearing that that National Defence and the Canadian government is saying no. It's saying that when July comes, July will be the end of this commitment of helicopters and people.
And that's always what Canada had signed up for. And so Canada is trying to demonstrate that, look, Canada is doing lots of other things that are key in terms of Canadian national interest, both the Iraq and the mission and the enhanced forward presence. And so that this is simply, you know, for a country that has limited assets going around, there's only so long that Canada can deploy these assets. To put this sort of in contrast, we only have 15 Chinook helicopters. We have 8 of these helicopters tied up on the Mali mission. That means, for instance, if these helicopters are required in Canada or North America, for instance, for
civil emergencies,
civil emergencies, transporting firefighting troops, whatnot, they are not available for, and so the Department of National Defense has to be very careful how it manages these assets. Keep in mind also, these are very expensive assets. One of these helicopters just to buy is well over $150 million. And it's, again, that amount to kind of keep on maintaining it over 20 years. So losing even just one means a significant loss.
Okay, looking at the mission then, one interesting thing is to look at, as you mentioned, you said this is a mission that's really overstretched, or it's looking for resources. I understand that before Canada contributed these helicopters, there was already a gap when the German-Belgian helicopter presence was withdrawn. The UN had to look, I think, to some private contractors to get helicopters temporarily until the Canadian helicopters arrived.
Lift is always the hardest element to find, in particular for these types of missions, whether it's rotary type lift, so helicopters, or fixed wing lift. And this is part of the reason why Canada procured the C-17 Globemaster, so these very large transport planes, because in a crisis, they're impossible to get on the open market or to lease. And this is part of the reason why Canada acquired the Chinook helicopters. But that shouldn't mean just because we've acquired that capacity, it now means that Canada always has to supply this. And this is part of also what we hear out of some of the allies who are a little frustrated with NATO, that it means burden sharing means everybody has capacity and can contribute that capacity in a meaningful fashion. And it shouldn't just be those members that happen to have those assets and could ostensibly deploy those assets, that they are always the ones who are going to be called upon to then provide those assets. And I think that's perhaps partially what Canada is concerned about. The other issue, of course, that units get scheduled. in terms of training, deployment, and then recovery. And so extending the mission means that you're now going to disrupt that particular wing's entire deployment, training, and recovery cycle, which means that if there is an emergency elsewhere in the world where these helicopters could be in dire need, Canada won't have the capacity within that wing to deploy those helicopters.
Okay, while we have you there, well, I think an interesting question is that there was so much debate prior to this deployment in Mali, so much discussion, very, very long process in fulfilling the promise. But a lot of Canadians would be asking themselves, what has happened on the Canadian mission so far? We've had these helicopters and support staff and medical personnel out there in Mali. What do we know about how the mission has gone since last July?
So this has always been sort of as a support mission and providing that lift capacity in particular because some of our European allies rightly insisted that for their troops to be on the ground and doing some of the much more dangerous work than what's involved in the helicopters. That's not to say that the helicopters themselves aren't engaged in dangerous missions. Required the capability to deploy troops quickly and to be able to extract those troops quickly. And that's what Canada committed to with these helicopters. They were never meant for sort of moving all sorts of things sort of across the country, for instance, and providing all sorts of humanitarian aid, whatnot. And so Canada, I think, wanted to make sure that they get used for the purpose for which they were deployed and didn't become sort of an all-around asset anytime somebody needed lift capacity. Because, of course, anytime you fly them, that's a considerable wear and tear on the equipment. And one of the things we learned after Afghanistan, that much of our equipment burned out much faster than the life cycle for which it had been scheduled. And so it's incumbent upon Canada to be responsible to Canadians and the taxpayer in terms of safeguarding the equipment that we have for the 20-year life cycle.
Have these helicopters seen use? Have we actually had some sorties? Because this is basically this is medical evacuation purposes mainly. Have they been used a lot?
Right. I mean, what we have sort of openly disclosed seems to be relatively limited in terms of the number of sorties. But I think what most of our European allies were looking for was particularly the ability to have that asset in case somebody runs into trouble. So measuring the number of sorties in and of itself is probably not the best metric to apply the rationale behind the deployment.
Okay, it's just because I refer to that because I saw in the article mentioning this issue referred to only 2 known sorties by them. And as you say, there's not a criticism. You have them there to be used if needed, and in a way you hope they're not needed for medical evacuations. But so this in a way has also corresponded to a mission which many people had called for, and that is to try and keep, I don't know, out of harm's way. I mean, a useful contribution, but without necessarily being in harm's way.
And that was always one of the risks with regards to the Mali mission. And so the government is also, I think, limiting the liability to which it exposes both itself and to which it exposes the Canadian Armed Forces. And I think the government is also just sending a message to European allies that's, look, we've been here for a year. You asked us to come. We made a contribution. It's time for someone else to step up.
Okay, Professor Leuprecht, thank you very much for taking the time. Thanks for putting us up to date on this.
My pleasure. Thank you.